Hi, Jonathan Lyman here. Welcome you to the first discussion for our winter quarter online psychopathology course. We're going to be talking some about the development of the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Illness, and getting some idea of how that instrument was developed and its utility for us in our practice in contemporary psychotherapeutic practices. We're going to talk some about the biosychosocial model, which is basically an attempt to create a nosology or a naming system for mental conditions. We'll be getting a sense of the difference between issues and symptoms, signs, and mental illnesses. Talk a little bit about, as I said, the biopsychosocial model for mental illnesses, and share a little bit about just some commonly used terminology and abbreviations. So let's go ahead with this basic background, preparing you for the first week's discussion forum. The DSM is something that has developed really over about 100 years of psychiatric practice, mental health practice in the United States. The first couple of DSMs were very esoteric, really focusing more on, especially DSM-2, the psychiatrist, Freudian-oriented approach to diagnosing mental illness. It was very subjective, very poor inter-rater reliability, and eventually wasn't found to be terribly helpful for people, especially outside of the narrow area of psychiatric practice. This was attempted to be addressed by the DSM-3, which adopted an entirely new approach to dealing with mental illness, looking more at signs and symptoms and attempting to identify clusters of signs and symptoms that typified different diagnoses. And the objective was to get to the point where several different people investigating a given client would be very likely to come to the same conclusion about the diagnosis. The earlier DSM had an assumption about the etiology or the source of mental illness and attributed all mental illness basically to internal psychological processes. The newer DSMs have adopted the biopsychosocial model of mental illness, and that postulates that in the case of mental illnesses and even in just lesser issues of life, there is a biological component, a social component, a psychological component at play in every instance, and these may have different degrees of significance in a given diagnosis or in a given individual's experience, but we need to be attentive to and aware of the significance of each of these factors. Frankly, I and many of my colleagues would add a fourth one, which is the spiritual domain. This has become most prominent in recent decades in the 12-step program, where typically clients are encouraged to think about how they perceive of a higher power and utilize that, if I can call it relationship, in their process of recovery and developing greater wellness. So let's talk a little bit about the biopsychosocial model and realize that the newer DSM does focus on symptoms, and we want to understand that the symptoms are clinically defined. Our language has hundreds, if not thousands, of words that describe people's feelings, emotional feelings, physical feelings, their inner state. Our profession wants to distill all of those hundreds of different terms down into a core set of symptoms and signs that are clearly defined and will be identified consistently by a broad range of observers. So that's the goal that we're working on. So we will comment a little bit on some of these things in application to perhaps one or two diagnoses. For example, anxiety is a symptom. We use the word worry, stressed, preoccupied, a number of other synonyms, but in our practice we focus on the term anxiety rather than using a hodgepodge or grab bag of somewhat similar terms that are difficult to tell whether we're talking about exactly the same thing or not. So instead of hundreds of things to try to measure and evaluate, we're zeroing in on just a few dozen, 2 or 3, maybe 4 dozen key areas of evaluation. I want to show you something here, if I can hold it up and make it visible to you. So we're talking about a little bit about the development of the DSM from the DSM-2 through the 3, which was the first to look at the biopsychosocial model and try to identify symptoms and not pay too much attention to the source or the etiology of mental illness. The DSM-4 was developed, I believe, about 1980. It was revised in around 2000, the 4TR, and just now, recently, the DSM-5 has been released, which continues to follow the biopsychosocial/spiritual model. It has added back in a little bit of an awareness of etiology as science has enabled us to make some significant progress in identifying some of the biological aspects of certain mental conditions. Research is beginning to find a few markers that underlie certain mental health conditions, and so the DSM-5 is trying to group diagnoses more according to the etiology underlying those diagnoses when we're able to distinguish that with some confidence. So it's a bit of a change, not a major one at this point. Now the biopsychosocial model and biopsychosocial spiritual model, as I said, postulates that we are including or looking at the influence of all of these areas in the development of a mental health condition. And we're not really so concerned about what caused it. We just want to be aware of the factors that are involved in it. Your book talks a little bit about the contrast between issues. We all have issues in our life, but having an issue doesn't mean you would be labeled as somebody having a mental illness, okay? Symptoms are these clearly defined attributes or traits that, when they're put together, can outline a particular mental health concern. So let's look here at a flow chart, as it was. Etiology, which is often abbreviated ET for convenience sake, speeds up the process of writing notes and reading, somehow causes symptoms to manifest in a person's life. We abbreviate symptoms by SX, okay? If I can get that in a little bit closer, make it perhaps a bit more legible. The symptoms, as they are identified and evaluated for severity and persistence and so on, cause us to come to the point where we identify at least a tentative diagnosis, which we will abbreviate in this class, and many others use the abbreviation DX, okay? Diagnosis is very important, not just because it gives us clarity of communication, but it also leads to a prescription, a treatment plan. Now, prescription, nowadays we often just use to refer to medication, but a prescription, even in contemporary use, could be for physical therapy, it could be for dietary adjustments. So it's not just medicine, though we often think of it that way, but a treatment plan. The prescription could include 50 sessions of therapy with your therapist or something as well. So the diagnosis implies certain preferential treatments, and so the treatment plan is being developed. Once the treatment plan is put in place, there's the actual application of that plan in concrete interventions, which is treatment identified, or abbreviated TX, okay? based on the availability of effective treatments and a clear diagnosis and a clear plan, we can identify the prognosis for a client's recovery, and that's abbreviated PX. As the treatment's applied and the prognosis hopefully turns out to be about what we anticipated, we have entered a new stage in the client's history, abbreviated HX, and we can perhaps confirm some thoughts about the genesis of the client's mental health condition. So again, the DSM focuses on not this entire cycle, but on symptoms and diagnosis. And as I said, the DSM-5 is taking into account a little bit of the improved understanding we have regarding etiology in terms of how they're clustering diagnoses in their publication. So let's see, we want to make sure that you understand a little bit about the role that this document is going to play in your practice in the future. It really is a crucial tool for your practice, both in getting a sense of how to proceed with identifying optimal treatments for the clients that you're working with. It really is essential in helping you to communicate clearly with your colleagues, with other professionals who are involved in caring for the clients that you will be working with. And certainly it's essential for being able to access the accumulated knowledge of the researchers that are so active in our field in current times. So next week we're going to focus a little bit on how to identify symptoms and how to evaluate those symptoms to help us to make a clear diagnosis and therefore inch towards establishing a treatment plan for our clients. But I hope that you will find this introduction helpful as you go ahead with our first discussion forum for this class. I think you'll find some very interesting things out as we work together over the next 10 weeks. Thank you very much.